Imagine for a moment that you're standing on the edge of the world. The wind rolls in off a steel-gray sea, carrying with it the smell of salt and pine smoke. Before you, nestled between mountains and fjord, a village stirs to life as the pale northern sun crests the horizon. This is home to the Norse people, a community bound together not by stone walls, but by kinship, shared purpose, and an unbreakable sense of belonging to the land itself. The word Viking actually refers to an activity, not a people. To go Viking meant to embark on an overseas expedition, raiding, trading, or exploring. Most Norse people never went Viking at all, spending their entire lives farming, fishing, and raising families in the same valley their grandparents had known. Norse communities called their home settlements farms, and these farms were the beating hearts of their world. A single farm might house an entire extended family, grandparents, parents, children, cousins, and even bonded servants, all living and working together under one long roof. That roof belonged to the Longhouse, the most iconic structure of Norse life. These extraordinary buildings could stretch over 30 meters in length, their curved wooden walls rising like the hull of an upturned boat against the hillside. Inside, a single great hall served as kitchen, dining room, bedroom, and workshop all at once. At the center of the Longhouse burned the hearth, an open fire that never truly went out. It was the source of warmth, the place where food was prepared, and the heart around which family life revolved. Smoke drifted lazily upward and out through a narrow opening in the roof, filling the hall with a permanent, comforting haze. The walls of the Longhouse were lined with raised wooden benches that served as seats by day and beds by night. Families slept together in these communal spaces, wrapped in woolen blankets and fur cloaks, their breath mingling in the cold air. Privacy, as we understand it today, was not something the Norse people particularly valued. To be alone was, in fact, to be vulnerable. Animals sometimes shared the Longhouse too, particularly during the brutal Scandinavian winters. Livestock would be brought inside and housed in a separate section at one end of the building. Their body heat helped warm the hall, and in return they were kept alive through the coldest months. The Norse were entirely pragmatic about survival. The farm and its surrounding land were known as the tuan, a word that gives us our modern English word town. This enclosed home field was the most intensively worked piece of land a family owned, fertilized, cultivated, and carefully tended through every season. Beyond it stretched the open meadows, forests, and mountains that the community shared. Norse communities practiced what we might now call transhumance, a seasonal migration of livestock. Each summer, animals were led up into the high mountain pastures called seder, where they would graze on fresh grass. Young women and girls typically accompanied the herds, living in small mountain shelters for months at a time, making butter and cheese that would sustain the community through winter. The Norse relationship with their land was deeply spiritual. Before breaking new ground for farming, it was common to perform small rituals, offerings of food or drink placed into the earth, to honor the spirits believed to inhabit it. These spirits, called landvetter or land wights, were thought to protect the farm and its people if properly respected. Horses held a place of extraordinary prestige in Norse society. They were not merely working animals, but symbols of status, used in rituals, gifted between allies, and sometimes sacrificed at great feasts in honor of the gods. To own a fine horse was to announce to the world that you were a person of consequence. The social world of a Norse community was organized around the concept of the ing, pronounced thing, a public assembly where free men gather to settle disputes, pass laws, and make collective decisions. This was democracy in one of its earliest forms, rough and sometimes violent, but genuine. The Icelandic Althing, established around 930 AD, is considered one of the world's oldest parliaments. Not everyone in Norse society was free. Slavery was a common and accepted institution. Enslaved people, called RLL, from which we get the English word thrall, were captured in raids, born into servitude, or reduced to that state through debt. They performed the hardest labor on the farm and had no legal rights of their own. Yet Norse society also had mechanisms by which enslaved people could earn or be granted their freedom. A freed person became a leisingi, occupying a legal status somewhere between slave and full freeman. Over generations, the descendants of freed slaves could rise to full social equality, a pathway that, while slow and uncertain, did exist. At the top of Norse society sat the Jarls, powerful chieftains and nobles who commanded large estates, led warriors, and exercised political authority over wide territories. Below them were the free farmers, the Karls, who formed the sturdy backbone of Norse communities. And at the bottom were the thralls, who made much of the hard daily work possible. Women in Norse society occupied a position of relative freedom compared to many cultures of the same era. A married woman, known as the husfreyja or house lady, managed the entire domestic economy of the farm. She held the keys to the storerooms, literally hanging from her belt, and this was not merely symbolic. Those keys represented real economic authority. Norse women could own property, inherit land, and initiate divorce. If a husband proved lazy, abusive, or incapable of providing for the family, his wife had legal recourse. The divorce was conducted simply. A woman declared her separation before witnesses at the front door of the house, and again at the couple's bed. With those words spoken, the marriage was dissolved. Children in Norse communities began learning their adult roles from a very young age. Boys would shadow their fathers in the fields, learning to handle tools, care for animals, and eventually take part in whatever trade or craft their family practiced. Girls learned spinning, weaving, cooking, and the complex art of managing a household, skills that were considered just as vital as any man's work. The Norse were masterful weavers. Textile production was a major domestic industry, and the quality of a family's cloth was a direct reflection of the skill and diligence of its women. Wool from their own sheep was spun into thread using a hand spindle and then woven on an upright loom. The resulting fabric was used for clothing, bedding, sails, and trade. Food preservation was one of the most important skills in the Norse world. Without refrigeration, communities relied on smoking, salting, fermenting, and drying to keep food through the long winters. Fish was a staple. Dried cod, known as stockfish, was so hardy it could last for years and became one of the most valuable trade goods the Norse produced. The Norse diet was more varied than many people imagine. Alongside fish and meat, they ate rye bread, oats, barley, root vegetables, wild berries, nuts, and dairy products. They made butter skyr, a thick fermented dairy food still eaten in Iceland today, and various cheeses. Honey was prized, not only as a sweetener, but as the basis of mead, their most celebrated drink. Mead, fermented honey mixed with water and sometimes flavored with herbs, was the drink of gods and heroes in Norse mythology. At feasts and gatherings, the passing of a mead horn from hand to hand was a ritual act of community and trust. Ale made from barley was more common in daily life, and even children drank weak, lightly fermented versions, as clean water was not always reliable. The Norse held elaborate feasts called Visler to mark important occasions, harvests, victories, marriages, and seasonal festivals. These feasts were not mere celebrations, but deeply social and political events. A chieftain who through lavish feasts earned loyalty, a host who was generous with food and drink built the social bonds that held communities together. Cooking was done in cauldrons suspended over the central fire, in clay pots nestled in the embers and on iron griddles. Whole animals were sometimes spit roasted for great feasts. The woman of the house typically oversaw the cooking, assisted by household thralls and older children. The smells of wood smoke, roasting meat, and simmering porridge would have been the constant perfume of daily life. Norse communities kept a remarkable variety of animals. Cattle provided milk, meat, and hides. Sheep gave wool and meat. Pigs were raised largely for their meat and fat. Goats were hardy and adaptable, able to survive on poor pastures. Chickens provided eggs. And dogs, bred for specific purposes like herding, hunting, or guarding, were trusted working partners and, in some cases, beloved companions. The Norse were skilled hunters. Deer, elk, bear, beaver, and various birds were all hunted for both food and their valuable pelts. Falconry, hunting with trained birds of prey, was a prestigious activity associated with the upper classes. The forests and mountains surrounding Norse settlements were not just wilderness, but a vital extension of the farm's resources. Fishing was equally important, both for local consumption and for the enormously profitable dried fish trade. Norse communities fished from small rowing boats in fjords and, more boldly, in open sea craft further offshore. They developed techniques for reading weather, tides, and stars that would eventually carry their descendants across the Atlantic Ocean to the shores of North America. The construction of boats was itself a community endeavor, requiring the collective effort of skilled craftsmen, laborers, and wealthy patrons. A great longship took months to build and required hundreds of planks of carefully split oak, bent and overlapped in the distinctive clinker style. The resulting vessel was flexible, lightweight, and extraordinarily seaworthy, a technological marvel of the medieval world. Woodworking was perhaps the most pervasive craft in Norse communities. It was used for everything: houses, furniture, tools, vehicles, weapons, bowls, cups, and decorative carvings. Norse craftsmen carved intricate patterns of intertwining animals and spiraling foliage into everything from doorposts to combs, expressing an aesthetic that was complex, restless, and alive. Blacksmiths occupied a special, almost magical status in Norse society. The ability to transform raw ore into tools, weapons, and jewelry seemed to the Norse like a form of sorcery. The smith's workshop was often located slightly apart from the main settlement, a separation that may reflect both the practical dangers of fire and the sense that the smith operated at the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Norse metalwork reached extraordinary levels of beauty and technical sophistication. Silver and gold were worked into jewelry, armbands, brooches, pendants, and intricate twisted neck rings called torques. Wealthy individuals might wear dozens of silver rings on their arms, serving simultaneously as personal adornment and portable wealth that could be cut and weighed in commercial transactions. Trade was absolutely central to Viking Age culture. Far from being merely raiders, the Norse were among the most ambitious and far-ranging merchants of the medieval world. Their trade networks stretched from Iceland and Greenland in the west to Constantinople and Baghdad in the east. They traded furs, amber, walrus, ivory, dried fish, slaves, and honey for silver, silk, spices, and glass. The town of Hedeby, in what is now northern Germany, was one of the most important Norse trading centers. Archaeological excavations there have revealed a remarkably cosmopolitan community where Norse, Frankish, Slavic, and even Arab merchants lived and traded side by side. The Norse were genuinely citizens of a wider world, culturally curious and commercially shrewd. Norse merchants used a system of weight-based silver currency rather than coinage. Silver was broken into pieces, hack silver, and weighed on small, folding balance scales that merchants carried with them. A deal was struck when both parties agreed that the weight of silver on one pan matched the value of goods on the other. Tiny lead weights, some shaped like animals or decorated with intricate designs, have been found across the Norse world. The Silk Road and the Norse world intersected in ways that still astonish historians. Norse traders traveled along the great rivers of Eastern Europe, the Volga and the Dnieper, reaching the Caspian Sea and trading directly with Arab merchants from the Abbasid Caliphate. Arabic silver coins, called dirhams, have been found in enormous quantities across Scandinavia, evidence of a commercial relationship that spanned thousands of miles. The Norse settlers who founded Kiev and Novgorod, known in Slavic sources as Varangians, played a formative role in the early development of Russia. Far from being purely violent invaders, they were traders and administrators who integrated with local Slavic populations over generations, creating hybrid cultures that blended Norse and Slavic traditions. Religion in Norse communities was deeply woven into the fabric of daily life. The Norse believed in a pantheon of gods, the Aesir, led by the one-eyed Odin, and the Vanir, associated with fertility and prosperity. These gods were not remote or transcendent figures, but active participants in the world, capable of helping or hindering human affairs depending on how well they were honored. Odin, the All-Father, was the god of wisdom, war, poetry, and death. He had sacrificed one eye at the well of Mimir in exchange for cosmic knowledge, and had hung himself on the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights to discover the runes, the sacred letters that held the power to shape reality. He was a god of paradox, wise and terrifying, generous and treacherous. Thor, son of Odin, was the god most beloved by ordinary Norse people. His great hammer, Mjolnir, protected both gods and humans against the forces of chaos and destruction. Thor was a god of storms and thunder, but also of agriculture and of ordinary folk, a powerful but accessible deity who could be called upon in daily life. Small hammer-shaped pendants, worn as amulets, have been found throughout the Norse world. Freya, the most powerful of the Vanir goddesses, presided over love, fertility, magic, and war. She was said to receive half of all warriors who died in battle, the other half going to Odin's great hall, Valhalla. Freya was the mistress of Seer, a form of magic associated with prophecy, fate weaving, and the ability to see and alter the destinies of individuals. She wept tears of gold for her absent husband, Ar. Religious practice in Norse communities centered on blood, a ritual sacrifice performed at key points in the agricultural calendar. The great midwinter feast of Yule, held around the time of the winter solstice, involved sacrifices of animals, communal feasting, and the drinking of toasts to the gods and to deceased ancestors. The 3 main blots were held at midwinter, at the onset of spring, and at midsummer. Norse temples, called Hoth, were not grand stone buildings, but wooden structures that could be modest or elaborate depending on the wealth of the community. The great temple at Uppsala in Sweden was described by the German chronicler Adam of Bremen as containing golden statues of Odin, Thor, and Freyr, and as the site of human sacrifice every 9 years, though historians debate the details of his account. The concept of fate was central to Norse belief. The Norns, 3 supernatural women named Verandi and Skuld, sat at the well of fate beneath Yggdrasil, weaving the destinies of gods and humans alike. What the Norns decreed could not be escaped, only met with courage and dignity. This fatalistic worldview gave Norse culture much of its characteristic mood: heroic, melancholic, and intensely present. Death and the afterlife occupied a significant place in Norse thought, but the afterlife was not uniform. Warriors who died in battle might be chosen by the Valkyries, supernatural female figures, to go to Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where they would feast and fight until the great final battle of Ragnarok. Others might go to the gentle realm of Folkvang, claimed by Freya. Those who died of illness or old age descended to the Hall of Hell, a quiet and gray but not necessarily terrible place. Norse burial practices were elaborate and varied by region, period, and social status. The most spectacular burials involved placing the deceased in a ship, either buried beneath a great mound of earth or set alight on water. The Oseberg ship burial, discovered in Norway in 1904, contained 2 women, a richly decorated ship, sledges, a wagon, textiles, kitchen equipment, and the remains of 15 horses and 4 dogs. Even ordinary people were buried with care and meaning. A farmer might be interred with his tools and weapons, a woman with her spindle and treasured jewelry. The grave goods were not merely possessions, but a provision for whatever existence awaited beyond death, a final act of care from the living for those who had departed. The Norse were among history's most enthusiastic practitioners of what we might call commemoration. Runestones, large standing stones inscribed with runic text, were raised across Scandinavia in honor of the dead. Most were raised by family members for a deceased relative, often noting that person's good qualities, their journeys, or the bridges and roads they had built. Thousands survive today, scattered across fields and churchyards. The runic alphabet, called the Futhar, after its first 6 letters, was a writing system used across the Norse world. Each rune was not merely a letter, but a concept associated with particular powers, meanings, and magical properties. The word rune itself comes from an Old Norse root meaning secret or whisper. Writing in runes was not a casual act. It was imbued with a sense of weight and permanence. Oral culture was perhaps even more important than written culture in the Norse world. Skalds, court poets, were among the most prestigious individuals in Norse society. They composed intricate verses called skaldic poetry, using complex meters and elaborate metaphors called kennings. The sea might be called the whale road, gold the fire of the sea, a warrior the feeder of ravens. These poems were performed at feasts and preserved the deeds of kings and heroes in living memory. The great mythological stories we know as the Norse Sagas were, for a long time, oral traditions passed from generation to generation around the evening fire. It was the extraordinary literary culture of medieval Iceland that eventually committed these stories to parchment, preserving for us the adventures of gods and heroes, the settlement of new lands, and the complex webs of honor and vengeance that govern Norse life. Iceland was itself one of the greatest Norse achievements in settlement. Discovered and colonized in the 9th century, largely by Norse settlers fleeing the consolidating power of Norwegian kings, Iceland was a land with no native human population, a blank slate on which a new society could be built from scratch. The settlers brought their language, their laws, their gods, and their livestock to this volcanic island at the edge of the world. The Icelandic landscape shaped its settlers profoundly. Geothermal hot springs provided natural bathing pools and, over time, a form of central heating for buildings. The lack of trees, Iceland's original birch forests were largely cleared for farmland and fuel within a century of settlement, forced the Norse settlers to adapt, building with turf and importing timber for the most essential purposes. In Greenland, Norse settlers established 2 colonies, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, around 985 AD, led by the irrepressible figure of Eric the Red, who had been exiled from Iceland following a killing. At their height, these settlements contained perhaps 5,000 people, supported by a mixed economy of farming, hunting, and the export of luxury goods like walrus ivory and polar bear pelts. And then, around 1000 AD, a Norse sailor named Leif Erikson sailed further west from Greenland and reached the North American continent, nearly 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus. He called the land he found Vinland, perhaps for the wild grapes or berries he found growing there. The Norse settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, is the only confirmed Norse site in the Americas, and its discovery in the 1960s rewrote our understanding of the age of exploration. Back in the Scandinavian heartland, the changing of seasons was the great rhythm that governed all of Norse life. Spring was a time of relief and renewal. The surviving livestock were led back to fresh pastures, fields were plowed and seeded, and ships that had been laid up for winter were relaunched into the fjords. There was an almost physical lightening of the collective spirit as the long dark retreated. Summer was a season of intense labor, and for those who went raiding or trading, of adventure. The seas were navigable, the days were long, and the Norse made maximum use of every hour of light. Ships departed for distant shores, merchants set out along the river roads of the east, and on the farms, every hand was employed in growing, harvesting, and preserving everything the family would need for the winter ahead. Autumn brought the great slaughter, the Hearthside, when animals that could not be fed through the winter were killed, and their meat smoked, salted, and stored. This was a time of hard, essential work and also, in a way, of abundance. The smell of blood, smoke, and wood fire would have hung over every settlement as communities worked together to prepare for the long darkness ahead. Winter in Scandinavia was not merely cold. It was dark in a way that those who have not experienced the far north can barely imagine. In the northernmost parts of Norway, the sun does not rise at all for weeks at a time. Communities drew close together, spending long evenings by firelight engaged in crafts, storytelling, games, and the complex social rituals that kept bonds strong through months of enforced proximity. Games were a beloved part of Norse life. Board games, including a strategy game called Nafadaful, a hunt the king game played on a grid, were played by all levels of society. Dice games, wrestling, swimming, running, and skiing competitions all featured at gatherings. The Norse were a physically active people who valued athletic prowess as a mark of good character. Storytelling was the great winter art form. Around the hearth, elders recounted the old tales, the mischief of Loki, the hammer-throwing of Thor, the wisdom of Odin, the doom of the gods at Ragnarok. These were not merely entertainment, but a form of cultural memory, transmitting values, history, and identity from one generation to the next. A good storyteller was as valued a guest as a skilled craftsman. Music, too, filled the Norse Longhouse. Simple instruments, lyres, flutes carved from bone, and drums provided accompaniment for songs and storytelling. We know tantalizingly little about Norse music since melodies were never written down, but we know that song was considered a gift from the gods and that skaldic performance involved a specific, trained singing style. Personal appearance mattered deeply to Norse people. Contrary to the popular image of the unwashed barbarian, archaeological evidence tells us that the Norse were remarkably attentive to grooming. Combs, carved from antler or bone, often beautifully decorated, are among the most common objects found in Norse graves and settlements. Evidence of ear picks, tweezers, and even what appear to be toothpicks has also been found. Clothing was a mark of identity, status, and craft. Men typically wore wool tunics belted at the waist, with trousers and cloaks fastened at the shoulder with decorative brooches. Women wore long dresses, sometimes with an overdress held in place by two characteristic oval brooches. The quality of fabric, the brightness of dyes, and the richness of embroidery all communicated social position at a glance. Natural dyes produced a surprisingly vibrant range of colors. Woad, a plant native to Europe, gave blues. Madder root produced reds and oranges. Various mosses and lichens yielded greens and yellows. Although the Norse could not achieve the saturated hues of, say, Mediterranean silk dyes, their clothing was far from the gray and brown uniformity often imagined. Bright color was associated with wealth and prosperity. Medical knowledge in Norse communities was a mixture of practical observation, herbal remedy, and spiritual intervention. Women were typically the primary healers. They managed childbirth, treated wounds and illnesses, and prepared the herbs and poultices that formed the basis of Norse medicine. Some women were renowned across wide regions for their healing knowledge, a form of expertise that commanded respect and sometimes fear. Childbirth was among the most dangerous experiences a Norse woman could face. Midwives attended births and a range of herbal preparations, some of which modern pharmacology has found to have genuine therapeutic effects, were used to ease labor and manage complications. Prayers and amulets invoking the protection of Freya, the goddess associated with domesticity and childbirth, were also employed. Viking Age Norse society placed enormous value on honor. A person's reputation, their drenskap, was perhaps their most important possession. To be known as honest, brave, generous, and true to one's word was the highest ambition. Conversely, to be labeled a coward, a thief, or an oath breaker was a kind of social death that could follow a family across generations. The importance of honor made conflict endemic. Insults, perceived slights, and failures to provide compensation for injuries or killings could set families against each other in cycles of vengeance that lasted decades. The Sagas, those great prose narratives of medieval Iceland, are largely built around these feuds, tracing with extraordinary moral complexity the obligations, choices, and tragedies that the honor system created. Yet the Norse also had developed legal mechanisms specifically designed to manage and contain violence. The Ing assembly could declare a particularly dangerous or intractable individual an outlaw, an outlaw. Stripped of all legal protection, an outlaw could be killed by anyone without legal consequence. Paradoxically, the threat of outlawry was one of the strongest forces for social order. Formal dueling, the home gang, was another legal mechanism for resolving disputes that could not otherwise be settled. Two parties would meet on a designated piece of ground, often an island or a marked square, and fight until one was incapacitated or conceded defeat. The victor was considered legally vindicated. Dueling was eventually outlawed in Iceland in 1006, partly because it was being exploited by skilled fighters to steal property from those less able to defend themselves. Trade, kinship, and alliance were as important as conflict in maintaining social order. Marriage was a key political instrument among elite families, used to seal alliances and end feuds. A good marriage settlement, negotiated with care and witnessed publicly, could end generations of bloodshed. The wedding itself, a multi-day feast involving oaths, rituals, and the sharing of food and drink between families, was one of the most significant events in a community's life. Friendship, formal ritualized friendship, was another important social bond. Two men might swear oaths of brotherhood, mingling their blood and pledging mutual support in a ceremony that created obligations nearly as strong as those of kinship. These sworn brotherhoods created networks of trust and support that extended far beyond the immediate family and were taken with complete seriousness. The Norse traveled with remarkable freedom and regularity. Even ordinary farmers might, over a lifetime, have sailed to England for trade, attended the great regional Ing assembly several days' ride away, and visited relatives in the next valley. For the Norse, movement was not exceptional. It was a natural part of life, and the ability to navigate by stars, landmarks, and the behavior of seabirds and marine animals was a practical skill many possessed. Navigation across open water was achieved without magnetic compasses. Those arrived in northern Europe only toward the end of the Viking Age. Norse sailors read the sea and sky with extraordinary acuity. The position of the sun, the stars at night, the direction of ocean swells, the color of the water, species and behavior of birds overhead, all of these were data points that an experienced navigator could read like a map. There is intriguing evidence that Norse sailors may have used a remarkable device called a solar stone, a crystal of Iceland spar that could detect the direction of polarized light from the sun even on heavily overcast days. Such a crystal, if held up to the sky and rotated until it glows uniformly, reveals the sun's position even when the sun itself is invisible. A crystal of Iceland spar was found aboard a 16th century English shipwreck, lending credibility to this theory. The Norse gods were not considered infallible or immortal in the conventional sense. Even the gods could be killed. Balder, the most beautiful and beloved of the gods, was slain through the treachery of Loki. And at Ragnarok, the great twilight of the gods, nearly all the major deities were destined to die in battle against the forces of chaos. This awareness of divine mortality gave the Norse pantheon a peculiar emotional resonance. Even the gods face the same relentless fate as humans. Loki, the trickster god, is perhaps the most psychologically complex figure in Norse mythology. He was neither fully evil nor fully good, but a force of creative disruption, sometimes a helper, sometimes a catastrophic menace. He was the father of monsters, the mother of Odin's eight-legged horse Sleipnir, the cause of Balder's death, and ultimately one of the leaders of the forces opposing the gods at Ragnarok. He is a figure who does not fit neatly into any moral category, which perhaps explains his enduring fascination. The world tree Yggdrasil was the great cosmological axis of Norse belief. This immense ash tree connected 9 worlds, including Skar, the realm of the gods, Migr, the world of humans, Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, and Hel, the realm of the dead. Its roots were gnawed by serpents, its branches sheltered an eagle and a hawk, and a squirrel named Ratatosk ran up and down its trunk, carrying insults between the eagle above and the serpent below. The universe was alive, interconnected, and perpetually in tension. As the Viking Age progressed, roughly from the late 8th century to the mid-11th century, Christianity began to penetrate Norse communities from the south and west. The process was gradual and often politically driven. Norwegian kings like Olaf Haraldsson, later Street Olaf, used Christian conversion as a tool for political centralization, attempting to replace the decentralized, locally rooted religious practices of the old religion with a church structure that answered to royal authority. The conversion of the Norse was far from clean or complete. For generations, many people practiced a form of religious blending, wearing a Thor's hammer and a Christian cross simultaneously, offering to the old gods at home while attending the new churches being built across the landscape. The boundaries between the old ways and the new were permeable, negotiated, and deeply personal. Iceland's conversion to Christianity in the year 1000 is one of the most remarkable political events of the Norse world. Faced with the threat of civil war between Christian and pagan factions, the Althing appointed a pagan chieftain named Jarls Svetningagoy to decide the matter. He spent a day and a night lying beneath his cloak in silent deliberation, then rose and declared that Iceland would become Christian, but that private pagan practice would be tolerated. It was compromise rather than conquest. The great Norse expansion of the 9th and 10th centuries transformed the map of Europe. Norse warriors and settlers established kingdoms in England, Normandy, Ireland, and Sicily. They served as the elite mercenary bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, the famous Varangian Guard. They founded Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick. They traded, raided, settled, and intermarried across a world that stretched from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. The settlement of Normandy from Northmen's land in the early 10th century had consequences that would reshape European history. The Norse settlers who established themselves there under the chieftain Rollo rapidly assimilated into Frankish culture, adopting the French language and Christian religion while retaining their military ferocity and political ambition. Their descendants, the Normans, would conquer England in 1066, southern Italy, and the Holy Land. In England, Norse settlers were so numerous that they left profound traces in language. Hundreds of everyday English words derive from Old Norse: sky, skin, knife, window, egg, husband, anger, happy, ugly, weak. These are all Norse words absorbed into English during the Viking Age. Place names ending in by meaning farm or village, Thor, outlying farmstead, and Thwaite, clearing, mark the former extent of Norse settlement across northern and eastern England. The Danelaw, that great swathe of northern and eastern England under Norse political control in the 9th and 10th centuries, was a bicultural zone where Norse and Anglo-Saxon communities lived side by side, intermarrying and exchanging customs, beliefs, and language. The legal concept of the jury, 12 men drawn from a community to decide matters of fact, may have Norse roots, reflecting the older tradition of the Ing assembly. Yet even as their influence spread across the world, the Norse communities of Scandinavia were changing from within. Population growth, climate fluctuation, and the emergence of centralized kingdoms began to transform the old social order. Powerful kings asserted authority over regional chieftains, diminishing the independence of the local Ing. The open, turbulent social world of the early Viking Age gradually gave way to more hierarchical, settled structures. The end of the Viking Age is conventionally dated to around 1066, the year that Harald Hardrada of Norway was defeated and killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge by the English King Harold Godwin's son, and the same year that William of Normandy, himself of Norse descent, defeated Harold at Hastings. These battles marked the end of the era in which Norse warriors could reshape kingdoms by force, though Norse cultural influence continued for centuries. The shift to Christianity brought new forms of literacy and new institutions, churches, monasteries, schools, that gradually transformed Norse communities. Latin learning coexisted with the old oral traditions. Churches were built on the sites of old temples, saints' days replaced pagan festivals, and Christian concepts of sin, redemption, and eternal life were slowly woven into the texture of daily life. Yet the old ways proved remarkably tenacious. The great mythological poems of the Poetic Edda were written down in Iceland in the 13th century, centuries after the official conversion to Christianity. The Sagas, those extraordinary prose narratives of Viking Age Iceland, were also composed in the 13th and 14th centuries, long after the events they described. They represent a remarkable act of cultural memory, a Christian society choosing to preserve and celebrate the pagan past. The legacy of the Norse in the modern world is far deeper than most people realize. The days of the week in English, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, are named for the Norse gods Tyr, in Arar and Frigg. The annual midwinter celebration that became Christmas was profoundly shaped by the Norse Yule festival. The concept of the Yule log, the evergreen tree, and the gift-giving figure who arrives in the darkest days of winter all have roots in the Old Norse world. The modern nations of Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Iceland are, in the deepest sense, continuations of Norse communities. The languages, the landscapes, the legal traditions, and even many folk customs preserve traces of the Viking Age. In Iceland, which was never conquered and whose population has remained relatively stable, these connections are particularly vivid. Old Norse and modern Icelandic are close enough that an educated Icelander can read the sagas in the original language. The Norse left behind not just words and place names, but a way of thinking about the world. Their intense focus on personal honor, individual courage, and the importance of how one faces fate, these are attitudes that have seeped into the cultures they touched and remain recognizable today. The Norse hero was not someone who achieved easy victory, but someone who faced inevitable loss with dignity and composure. The image of the Norse in popular culture has swung between extremes of romance and vilification. The 19th century Romantic movement created a Norse revival that celebrated Viking heroes as archetypes of freedom and vitality. The 20th century saw that image distorted by fascist movements that attempted to claim Norse symbols and mythology for their own purposes. Today, scholars and enthusiasts work to recover a more nuanced and accurate understanding of a complex, creative, and deeply human civilization. Archaeological discoveries continue to reshape our understanding of Norse life in significant ways. The recent discovery of a high-status Norse grave containing a biological female skeleton alongside weapons, chess pieces, and 2 horses initially interpreted as a female warrior has sparked intense academic debate about gender, identity, and social roles in Viking Age society. The Norse world may have been more complex in its understanding of gender than previously assumed. The environmental impact of Norse settlement was, by modern standards, considerable. The clearance of forests for farmland in Iceland and Greenland caused significant soil erosion, a problem that Icelandic sagas themselves acknowledge with a kind of melancholy. In Greenland, the Norse colonies eventually disappeared in the 15th century, perhaps partly due to environmental degradation, changing climate, and the withdrawal of the European trade routes they depended on. The Norse relationship with the natural world was one of profound intimacy. They did not conceive of nature as something separate from human life, a backdrop to human drama, but as a living presence inhabited by spirits, threaded with divine significance, and responsive to human behavior. To farm the land, to sail the sea, to hunt in the forest, these were not merely economic activities, but relationships requiring respect, gratitude, and attention. In the quieter moments of Norse life, a woman spinning by the fire while her children slept, a farmer watching the first light touch the snow-covered mountains, a ship's crew passing a flask of ale on a calm evening as the stars appeared. There was a quality of attention that comes through even across 1,000 years. These were people who paid close attention to the world around them, who found meaning in its details, and who knew that the good moments were precious precisely because they did not last. The Norse sense of beauty was inseparable from their sense of impermanence. The most celebrated quality a person could possess was not invincibility, but the ability to face mortality with grace. Their word hue, roughly translatable as spirit or heart, described the animating force within a person that persisted after death in the memory of those who had known them. To live so well that one's hugr endured in the hearts of others was the closest the Norse came to immortality. And so, sitting by that imagined fire as the night deepens around the Longhouse, the children finally asleep in their bench beds, the animals shifting gently in the shadows, the last of the day's ale cooling in its cup, we might feel, across all the centuries, something recognizable. The need for warmth, for belonging, for stories that make sense of the world. The fear of the dark and the defiant brightness of the fire against it. The Norse did not think of themselves as historical figures. They were simply people living their lives as fully as they could between the uncontrollable forces of weather and fate, finding joy in feasts and friendship, sorrow in loss and separation, meaning in the old stories, and comfort in the rhythms of the seasons. They were, at bottom, very like us, which is perhaps why their world continues to call to us across so many centuries of silence. The fire has burned low. Outside, snow settles silently over the roof of the Longhouse, and somewhere in the darkness a wolf calls across the valley. Inside, everything is warmth and shadow, the slow breath of sleeping children, the occasional shift and sigh of the cattle at the far end of the hall. There's more to know about these people. There always is. Let the story continue. The Norse did not call themselves Vikings. They called themselves Norsemen, Northmen, or simply by the name of their region, Danes, Norwegians, Swedes. The word Viking comes from the Old Norse Viking, which may derive from vik, meaning inlet or bay. those who lurked in the bays waiting to raid, or from an Old English word meaning to travel or roam. Even now, scholars are not entirely certain of its origin. The famous horned helmets so associated with the Norse in popular imagination are almost entirely a myth. Genuine Norse helmets that have survived are rounded iron caps, sometimes with a nose guard. The one complete Viking Age helmet ever found, the Jormungbu helmet, discovered in Norway, is a simple, elegant iron dome. Horned helmets existed in Scandinavia, but they were ceremonial objects from the Bronze Age, thousands of years before the Viking Age began. Norse shields were round, typically around 80 centimeters in diameter, made from planks of wood glued and pinned together, with a central iron boss protecting the sword hand. They were painted, often in bold geometric designs or animal motifs, and the edge was sometimes reinforced with rawhide. When not in battle, shields were hung along the sides of ships, a practice that both protected the crew from spray and displayed the ship's martial identity to those watching from shore. The Norse sword was among the finest cutting weapons of the medieval world, crafted using a technique called pattern welding, twisting and folding different grades of iron together before welding them into a single blade. The resulting weapons combined hardness and flexibility in ways that simpler iron swords could not match. The blades were often given names like living things and passed down through generations as family treasures. Bows and arrows were widely used by Norse warriors, both in battle and in hunting. The longbow, later so famously associated with English armies, was a Norse and Germanic weapon before it became English. Arrows were tipped with iron heads of various designs, broad, leaf-shaped heads for hunting, long, narrow bodkin points for punching through armor. An archer who could loose quickly and accurately was a formidable asset in any Viking Age engagement. Norse armies were not the disorganized mobs of popular imagination. They could and did form disciplined shield walls, ranks of warriors locking their shields together edge to edge, advancing in unison, their combined strength far greater than the sum of its parts. Breaking a shield wall was one of the central tactical problems of Viking Age warfare, and battles were often decided in the grinding, exhausting push that followed the two walls meeting. The berserkers, warriors who fought in a state of apparent battle frenzy, seemingly immune to pain and fear, are one of the most enduring Norse mysteries. Norse sources describe these fighters as wearing bear or wolf skins and fighting with terrifying ferocity. Whether their condition was the result of ritual practice, certain plants or fungi, a form of battle trance, or simply literary exaggeration remains debated. The word berserk, to go berserk, survives in English to this day. Chainmail, interlocking rings of iron, was the most effective body armor of the Viking Age, but it was also expensive and time-consuming to make. A full mail shirt required tens of thousands of individually hand-linked iron rings and represented weeks of skilled labor. Only wealthy warriors could afford it. The majority of Norse fighters went into battle with leather or quilted textile armor, which offered meaningful protection against glancing blows, but was far less reliable against a direct strike. The Norse fought on land and at sea, but their greatest tactical advantage was often the ship itself. A Viking longship could be beached on almost any shore. Its shallow draft meant it needed no harbor, only a sloping beach or riverbank. Raids were therefore possible against places that believed themselves safe from naval attack because they had no dock. The ability to appear without warning anywhere a boat could float was the fundamental terror of the Viking Age. Norse raids on monasteries have given the Viking Age much of its dark reputation, but the targeting of monasteries was coldly rational. Monasteries were wealthy, filled with silver plate, illuminated manuscripts bound in jeweled covers, grain stores, and livestock, and they were largely undefended. The monks who inhabited them, sworn to nonviolence and prayer, were poorly positioned to resist armed raiders. The Norse were not uniquely savage, they were simply effective. Not all Norse overseas activity was violent. The Norse who settled in Iceland and Greenland were not raiders but colonists, bringing their families, livestock, and household goods in open ships across hundreds of miles of open ocean. The settlers who established themselves in Normandy, Ireland, and the English Danelaw were building communities, not conducting hit-and-run attacks. The full range of Norse overseas activity was vast and varied. Dublin was essentially a Norse city for almost 3 centuries. Founded as a longship base in the early 9th century, it grew into a major trading town and political center. The Norse kings of Dublin were significant players in the complex politics of early medieval Ireland, forming alliances, fighting wars, and intermarrying with Irish dynasties. Modern Dublin still sits on the same strategic position the Norse chose, and archaeological excavations beneath its streets have revealed a remarkably well-preserved Norse urban landscape. The Norse presence in Scotland was extensive and long-lasting. The Northern Isles, Orkney, and Shetland were so thoroughly settled by Norse colonists in the 9th century that the original Pictish population and culture were almost entirely absorbed. For centuries, these islands were politically part of Norway, not Scotland, and their place names, folk customs, and even dialects still carry vivid traces of the Norse world. The Norse also settled the Faroe Islands, a remote archipelago of volcanic rock between Norway and Iceland, and may have been preceded there by Irish monks who used the islands as remote hermitages. The meeting of Norse settlers with the traces left by Christian hermits in the most isolated places of the North Atlantic is one of the quietly fascinating stories of the early medieval world. Norse mercenaries served in armies and courts across the medieval world. The Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Empire, an elite unit of Norse warriors who served as the personal bodyguard of the emperor in Constantinople, was one of the most prestigious military formations of the age. Harold Hardrada, who would later claim the English throne and die at Stamford Bridge, served in the Varangian Guard in his youth, accumulating both wealth and military experience. Constantinople, which the Norse called Miklagar, the Great City, was the richest and most sophisticated urban center the Norse ever encountered. Norse soldiers and merchants who saw its massive walls, its gilded churches, its busy markets stocked with goods from 3 continents, and its population of hundreds of thousands must have experienced something like the cognitive vertigo of arriving in an alien world. The contrast with a Norwegian fjord settlement could hardly have been more extreme. Norse merchants in the east gave their name to an entire country. The Slavic peoples of what is now Russia called the Norse traders and settlers who passed through their lands Russ, possibly from a Finnish word for rowers. The Kievan Rus state that emerged from the mingling of Norse and Slavic cultures gave its name, eventually, to Russia itself. The Norse contribution to Russian origins remains a point of lively historical and political debate. The Norse encountered the indigenous peoples of North America, the people they called Skrælingr, during their explorations of the continent around 1000 AD. These encounters were sometimes peaceful, involving trade, but often turned violent. The Norse settlements in North America were ultimately abandoned, probably because the colonists were too few and too isolated to sustain themselves against the resistance of local populations who had no reason to welcome permanent settlers. The Norse Greenlanders maintained contact with their Scandinavian homelands for over 4 centuries, exporting luxury goods, walrus ivory, polar bear furs, live polar bears, narwhal tusks, in exchange for iron, timber, and grain. When the European market for ivory collapsed in the 14th century due to the arrival of cheaper African elephant ivory, the economic basis of the Greenland colonies was severely undermined. Combined with a cooling climate and the spread of the Black Death through their trading partners in Europe, the colonies gradually faded, and eventually vanished entirely sometime in the 15th century. The Norse understood the approximate shape of the world they inhabited with remarkable accuracy. They knew that sailing west from Norway led to Shetland, then Faroe, then Iceland, then Greenland, then an unknown land beyond. They understood the concept of latitude. The further north you sailed, the longer the summer days, even without the mathematical framework to express it. Their geographical knowledge was practical, experiential, and extraordinarily hard-won. Runes were carved on a remarkable variety of surfaces. What was the most common? Wooden sticks inscribed with messages, records, or charms, but most wood has not survived the centuries. What has survived includes runestones, metal objects, bone combs, drinking horn mounts, and even a few weapons. A sword found in Norway bears a runic inscription that has never been fully deciphered. The runes on it may be a personal name, a prayer, or a charm of some kind. Their silence is a reminder of how much has been lost. The practice of carving runes for magical purposes was widespread and deeply serious. A runic charm might be carved onto a small piece of wood and worn around the neck to ward off illness, attract luck, or invoke the protection of a specific god. The carver's knowledge, which runes to use in what combination and order, was a form of specialist knowledge that not everyone possessed. To know the runes in their full depth was considered a form of wisdom approaching that of Odin himself. Norse skalds sometimes composed in extremely complex meters that required extraordinary skill to produce and to appreciate. The meter called drakvi, the court meter, required 8 syllables per line, 3 stresses, 2 alliterations in the first half of each line, matching with 1 in the second, and internal rhyme. Producing a technically correct verse in this meter, while simultaneously making the content meaningful, was the work of a dedicated specialist. It was the Norse equivalent of writing perfect sonnets on demand, often in the middle of a battle. The kenning, the elaborate compound metaphor of skaldic poetry, was not mere decoration, but a form of encrypted meaning that a trained audience could decode with pleasure. To call blood the sweat of the sword or the sky the helmet of the earth was not merely poetic. It demonstrated knowledge, wit, and mastery of a shared cultural vocabulary. Understanding kennings was itself a mark of education and sophistication. Women could be skalds too, though far fewer are recorded. A woman who composed and performed poetry was called a skaldkona, and while they were less common than their male counterparts, the existence of female poets in a culture that valued poetic skill so highly is a reminder that Norse gender roles, while distinct, were not as rigid as they might appear from a distance. The Eddic poems, the great mythological and heroic verses that form the backbone of our knowledge of Norse religion, were composed in a different, plainer style than skaldic poetry. They used a looser meter closer to natural speech, which made them more accessible to wider audiences and better suited to the epic subject matter of gods, heroes, and the fate of the world. The Poetic Edda, preserved in a single Icelandic manuscript from around 1270, is one of the most important literary documents of the medieval world. Snorri Sturluson, the 13th century Icelandic chieftain, historian, and poet who wrote the Prose Edda and the Heimskringla, a history of Norwegian kings, is perhaps the most important single figure in the preservation of Norse mythology. Without his work, our knowledge of the Norse gods would be a fraction of what it is. He was a complex, politically ambitious man who lived in turbulent times and was eventually assassinated at the age of 60. The world of Norse scholarship owes him an incalculable debt. Norse legal culture was sophisticated and highly developed. Laws were not written down in the early period. They were memorized and recited at the ing by specialists called lagsögumenn, law speakers. Iceland's first law speaker, Ulfljot, was sent to Norway specifically to study Ulating law before returning to codify rules for the new Icelandic Commonwealth. The The Icelandic law speaker was required to recite 1/3 of the entire law code aloud at each Althing meeting, a feat of memory that defies easy comprehension. The concept of N, a form of extreme social humiliation, was one of the most feared sanctions in Norse society. To be accused of N was to have your honor destroyed, your masculinity impugned, and your social standing annihilated. Such accusations could legitimately be answered with lethal violence, and composing Unsa, a satirical verse designed to humiliate, was actually illegal in Iceland and Norway, so serious were its social consequences considered. Norse poetry could also be tender and deeply personal. Love poetry, lament, and verses addressed to individuals who had died are all attested in the Norse record. The poem Sonnetarek, roughly translatable as The Loss of Sons, composed by the Icelandic skald Egil Skallagrimsson after the death of 2 of his sons, is one of the most moving pieces of personal lament in medieval literature. Egil was so devastated that he refused to eat and lay in darkness for days before his daughter persuaded him to express his grief through verse. The Norse conception of the self was more fluid and distributed than the modern Western idea of the individual. A person was not merely their physical body, but a complex of interconnected spiritual elements, the hammer or shape, the huger or spirit, the fylgja or guardian spirit, and others. These elements could, in certain circumstances, separate from the body during sleep, through shamanic practice, or at the moment of death. And the Norse took their interactions with these non-physical realities seriously. The fylgja, a kind of personal spirit or fetch, was often conceived as an animal that accompanied a person through life, invisible to most but sometimes glimpsed in dreams or at the moment before death. The nature of a person's fylgja was thought to reflect their own character. A great warrior might have a bear or wolf, a wise person an eagle. The death of the fylgja was often seen as a harbinger of the person's own end. Dreams were treated with great seriousness in Norse culture. Significant dreams were believed to carry genuine prophetic weight and were recounted to trusted advisors for interpretation. Before major undertakings, a voyage, a battle, a marriage negotiation, the Norse would often pay close attention to the dreams of respected community members. The sagas are full of prophetic dreams that come true, suggesting that this belief permeated all levels of Norse society. The Volva, a traveling seeress who practiced a form of shamanic divination called seer, was one of the most important and ambiguous figures in Norse religious life. She would arrive at a community, be treated as an honored guest with a special feast, and then enter a trance state, sometimes seated on a special platform, sometimes with the assistance of other women singing ritual songs, in which she could perceive hidden truths and communicate with spirits. Her pronouncements on harvests, health, and futures were taken with complete seriousness. Odin himself was said to practice seer, which was considered a somewhat shameful thing for a male deity, since seer was primarily a woman's art. The complex Norse attitude toward this contradiction, the highest of the gods doing something considered unmasculine, has fascinated scholars of gender and religion. It suggests that the Norse were well aware of the transgressive quality of certain spiritual practices and integrated that transgression into the mythology itself. The relationship between the Norse gods and their great enemies, the giants or Jotnar, was far more complicated than simple opposition. The gods and giants intermarried, traded, and conversed. Odin's mother was a giantess. Thor's mother was the earth goddess Jar, herself of giant lineage. Many of the most important objects in the mythological world, including Mjolnir itself, were made by the dwarves, who occupied their own ambiguous position between the worlds. The Norse cosmos was a place of constant negotiation between forces, not a simple battle between good and evil. Dwarves in Norse mythology were master craftsmen, the greatest artificers in all the 9 worlds. They made Odin's spear Gungnir, which never missed its mark. They made Freya's ship Skablana, which could sail any sea and fold up small enough to fit in a pocket. They made the golden hair of Sif, Thor's wife. And they made Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, though the handle came out slightly shorter than intended because Loki, characteristically, had sabotaged the process. The great serpent NHGGR, gnawing at the roots of Yggdrasil, and the eagle perched in the tree's highest branches were in a relationship of perpetual antagonism, each representing forces that could not be reconciled. Ratatoskr, the squirrel who ran between them carrying insults, has been interpreted as a symbol of rumor, gossip, and the communications that inflame conflict rather than resolve it. Even the world tree's internal dynamics mirrored the social tensions of the human communities sheltering beneath it. The afterlife realm of Valhalla was not merely a paradise of feasting and fighting. The warriors there, the Einherjar, were training for Ragnarok, the final battle between gods and chaos. Each day they would fight and kill each other, and each night their wounds would heal, and they would feast together, preparing for the day when Odin would need every soul he had gathered to stand against the forces of destruction. Valhalla was at its heart a military training ground, sustained by the hope, ultimately futile, of changing fate. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, was not experienced by the Norse as a distant theological abstraction, but as a felt possibility, woven into the texture of daily life. The signs of its approach, 3 consecutive winters without summer, the breaking of all bonds of kinship, the swallowing of the sun by the wolf Fenrir, were the deepest fears of a society that depended on seasonal cycles and family loyalty for survival. Ragnarok was the ultimate Viking Age nightmare, winter without end, and the failure of all human bonds. Yet even Ragnarok was not the absolute end in the Norse worldview. After the destruction, the mythology describes a renewal, a new earth rising green and fertile from the sea, the surviving children of the gods gathering in the ruins of the old world, and a new cycle of life beginning. This cyclical vision, destruction followed by renewal, resonates with the agricultural rhythms that govern Norse life. The death of winter and the resurrection of spring, endlessly repeated. The Norse calendar was organized around the agricultural year rather than any astronomical abstraction. The year was divided into 2 main seasons, summer and winter, with the transitions between them being major ritual occasions. The first day of summer was celebrated with offerings and festivities, the first day of winter similarly. The concept of a 4-season year was introduced to Scandinavia with Christianity, replacing an older 2-season framework rooted in the rhythms of farming and livestock. The Norse measurement of time within a day was approximate and sensory rather than mechanical. There were no clocks. Time was marked by the position of the sun, the habits of animals, the progress of tasks. A job described as taking a milking time conveyed its duration more meaningfully to a Norse farmer than any numerical measurement. The Norse word stund, a short period of time, survives in modern Scandinavian languages and gives a sense of how time was conceived, as a stretch, a span, a lived experience rather than a counted quantity. Norse medicine used plants extensively, and modern pharmacology has validated some of their treatments. Yarrow, used to pack wounds and slow bleeding, contains compounds with genuine coagulant properties. Juniper berries were used as a diuretic, which they are. Bog myrtle was used to treat skin conditions. The women who managed this herbal knowledge were not superstitious amateurs, but practical healers whose understanding had been refined by generations of observation and use. The role of the seer practice in Norse healing is often overlooked. Beyond prophecy and divination, seer could be used therapeutically, to trace the cause of an illness to a spiritual disruption, to recover a person's lost spirit, or to remove a magical curse. This spiritual healing work existed alongside and intertwined with the herbal and practical medicine of everyday Norse life, the two approaches complementing rather than contradicting each other. Norse communities had a strong sense of collective responsibility for the welfare of their members. The elderly and the permanently disabled were not simply abandoned. A farmer who became too old to work retained rights to food and shelter from whoever inherited the farm. These obligations were legally enforceable. The concept of fostering, was used not just for children, but sometimes for elderly relatives, with families formally taking on the care of those who could no longer fend for themselves. Fostering of children was a widespread and important practice in Norse society. Children were regularly sent to live with relatives or allies for periods of their upbringing, a practice that cemented social bonds between families and gave children access to skills and networks beyond their immediate family. To foster another's child was an act of honor. The child fostered was often treated as warmly as one's own. Norse households practiced a form of hospitality that was both morally required and socially policed. To turn away a traveler seeking shelter was a serious failure. Guests were fed and housed without question for at least 3 nights, the conventional period before reciprocal questions about identity and purpose could reasonably be asked. The mythological archetype of the disguised traveler who tests a household's hospitality and who turns out to be Odin in disguise gave this duty a divine weight. The giving of gifts was central to Norse social life in ways that went far beyond mere generosity. Gift exchange was the engine of alliance, the mechanism by which trust was built and obligations created. A gift demanded a return gift, not necessarily equal, but meaningful. A leader who gave generously in return for service and loyalty was fulfilling a social contract, and a leader who failed to give, who was Jarl, greedy for wealth, was failing in the most fundamental responsibility of leadership. The Norse word gift, like its English cognate, was also the word for poison in some early Norse dialects. This double meaning was not merely linguistic coincidence, but a reflection of the ambiguous power of the gift itself. A generous gift could bind a recipient in obligation, as surely as poison could bind a body. The Norse were acutely aware that generosity and manipulation could be two faces of the same action. Norse children played with toys that would be recognizable to children today. Carved wooden animals, miniature boats, and small figures have been found in Norse settlements. Children also played with real tools from an early age. The Norse valued practical competence and did not sharply separate play from learning. A young boy's toy boat was also a way of learning the skills of boat construction and water navigation that might one day save his life. Dice and gaming pieces found at Norse sites reveal a culture that loved games of chance and strategy. The game of Nefadafel, the King's Table, was played across the Norse world and beyond. Unlike chess, which arrived in Europe from Islamic world during the Viking Age and gradually displaced it, Nefadafel is an asymmetric game. One player commands a small central force trying to move the king to safety, while the other commands a surrounding force trying to capture him. It is a game about survival and breakout, themes that resonated deeply in Norse culture. The Norse relationship with alcohol was complex and ritually laden. Drinking was not merely social but ceremonial. Toasts were made to the gods, to the memory of the dead, and to the success of upcoming ventures. The horn was passed around the table in a specific order, and to refuse to drink when offered the horn was a social transgression. Moderation was admired. Excessive drunkenness, especially if it led to rash behavior or violence, was considered shameful. The Norse made a fermented drink from birch sap, collected in spring when the sap was running. Birch sap has a faint, sweet, slightly woody flavor and contains sugars that ferment readily. This seasonal drink was a welcome variation in a diet that could become monotonous through the winter months, and the arrival of birch sap season was itself a marker of spring's progress, a sign that the long darkness was truly ending. Fire was sacred in Norse thought in a way that went beyond its obvious practical importance. The hearth fire represented continuity. Ideally, it was never fully extinguished, the embers of one day's fire being used to kindle the next. When a new farm was established, fire from the old family hearth might be carried to light the first fire in the new home, creating a living thread of connection between the two places. The fire carried memory. Water, too, held deep spiritual significance. Sacred springs, rivers, and lakes were sites of offering throughout the Norse world. Objects of great value, weapons, jewelry, even people, were committed to lakes and bogs as sacrifices to the powers believed to inhabit them. The extraordinary finds preserved in Scandinavian bogs, including the famous Tala Man, predate the Viking Age, but the spiritual tradition of water deposition continued into Norse times. The bog bodies of Scandinavia, those eerily preserved human remains found in peatlands across Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, are mostly pre-Viking Age, but they speak to a deep and enduring spiritual tradition of offering to the watery world. The careful treatment of some of these bodies, their apparent ritual killing, the way they were placed, the objects found with them, suggests a tradition of human sacrifice to the powers of the earth, the dark water, and the liminal world between the living and the dead. Norse communities were keenly attentive to the behavior of animals as signs of coming events. The arrival of certain birds, the unusual behavior of cattle, the unexpected appearance of predators near the farm. All of these could be read as meaningful messages from the spirit world or the gods. This was not mere superstition, but a form of attentiveness to the natural environment that had real practical value. Animals often do detect changes in weather, ground stability, and predator presence before humans do. The raven held a special place in Norse symbolism because of its association with Odin, who kept two ravens, Hugin thought and Munin memory, who flew across the world each day and returned at evening to whisper what they had seen into the god's ear. Ravens followed Norse armies and raiding parties, feeding on the dead, and their presence was therefore both a practical omen of battle and a reminder of Odin's watching presence. A raven banner, a flag bearing a raven motif, was flown by several Norse military forces, including the armies of the Danish Great Heathen Army that invaded England in 865. Cats were prized in Norse households, primarily for their ability to protect grain stores from rodents, but they also held a specific mythological status. Freya's chariot was drawn by two large gray or blue cats, and offerings to Freya sometimes involved cats. The Norse cats were domestic cats of the type introduced to Scandinavia from the Near East, but they were often large. The Norwegian forest cat, a breed still known for its size and thick fur adapted to the Nordic climate, may descend directly from these Viking Age felines. The relationship between the Norse and their landscape was expressed in the names they gave to places. Norse place names across the lands they settled are extraordinarily descriptive, naming hills, streams, rocks, and fields for their shape, their qualities, their spiritual associations, or the events that occurred there. To walk through a Norse-settled landscape and understand the meaning of its names is to read a layer of human perception laid down over 1,000 years ago, still legible in the present. Norse communities built roads and bridges as acts of public service and commemoration. Runestones frequently record that a particular person built a bridge or cleared a road, not merely as practical infrastructure, but as an act of honor that demonstrated the builder's wealth, generosity, and concern for the community. To make passage easier for travelers, pilgrims, and traders was a form of gift to the world, as worthy of commemoration as any feat of arms. The Norse were pioneers in the establishment of urban markets. Emporia, trading towns, were established at key points along Norse trade routes from the 8th century onward. Birka in Sweden, Koppang in Norway, and Ribe in Denmark were among the earliest urban settlements in Scandinavia, places where merchants from different regions could meet in relative safety to exchange goods, establishing the beginnings of commercial culture in a previously rural world. Silver hoards, collections of silver coins, hack silver, and jewelry buried for safekeeping, are found throughout the Norse world in extraordinary numbers. Many were never retrieved, suggesting that the people who buried them died before they could return, or that circumstances changed so catastrophically that return became impossible. Each hoard is a small, buried tragedy, someone's life savings, hidden in hope and never recovered, waiting in the earth for centuries until a modern plowshare or metal detector disturbs the ground. The Norse used animal fat, particularly from seals and whales, as a fuel, a food, a lubricant, and a wood preservative. Whale hunting was practiced in Norway from prehistoric times and continued through the Viking Age. The Norse word for a dead whale washed up on a beach, valriki, a whale drift, was a term for extraordinary good luck, since a beached whale could provide a community with oil, food, and material for months. Amber, fossilized tree resin found on the beaches of the Baltic, was one of the most valuable trade goods the Norse and their Baltic neighbors produced. Prized across the ancient world for its warm color and its electrostatic properties, rubbing amber produces a static charge, and the Greek word for amber, electron, gives us our word electricity. Amber beads and pendants have been found at Norse sites far from the Baltic, evidence of its long-distance trade value. The Norse were skilled in the working of antler and bow. Combs, needles, pins, gaming pieces, and knife handles were all carved from these materials with great skill. Antler from red deer and reindeer was particularly valued for its toughness and workability. In regions like northern Norway, where contact with Sami reindeer herders was common, antler was an important trade good moving from the interior to the coastal settlements. The Sami people, the indigenous inhabitants of northern Scandinavia, and the Norse lived in complex, long-standing contact that was sometimes collaborative and sometimes exploitative. The Norse imposed tribute, furs, dried fish, antler, on Sami communities, but they also traded, intermarried, and exchanged knowledge. Norse sources record fascination with Sami shamanic practices, which in some ways paralleled, and in others exceeded the seer traditions of the Norse themselves. The boundary between the two cultures was never as sharp as either side might have drawn it. Norse ships required constant maintenance. The clinker-built hull planks swelled and contracted with changes in temperature and moisture, opening and closing tiny gaps that needed regular caulking, stuffing with tarred animal hair or moss to remain watertight. The tarring of a ship's hull was a regular spring maintenance task, and the smell of pine, tar became one of the defining smells of any Norse harbor. A well-maintained ship was a matter of life and death. A neglected hull could mean death in a cold northern sea. The Norse used a type of steering, or rather than a central rudder for controlling their ships, a large or fixed to the right side of the stern. This is the origin of the word starboard, which comes from the Old Norse stjernborði, the steering board side. The left side was accordingly known as the port side because when coming into harbor the steering oar side was kept away from the dock and the ship was moored on its left. These nautical terms are among the most direct Norse contributions to everyday English. Norse women sometimes accompanied their husbands and families on overseas voyages. The settlement of Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands could not have happened without women. They were not merely passive passengers, but essential colonists, managing the household economy that made permanent settlement viable. DNA studies of modern Icelandic populations have confirmed that the female settlers of Iceland were drawn from a wider range of origins than the male settlers, suggesting some came from the British Isles, possibly as captives or willing companions acquired during Norse raids and settlements there. The concept of utisita, sitting out, was a form of solitary spiritual practice in which a person would spend a night alone on a burial mound or in a wild, liminal place, seeking contact with the dead or with hidden powers. This practice required courage, since burial mounds were believed to be inhabited by the spirits of the dead, dangerous, potentially malevolent entities who did not always welcome the living. The knowledge or prophecy obtained through Udacita came at a cost. The seeker had to venture into territory where normal social protections did not apply. Ghosts, Draugr, were a genuine fear in Norse communities. Unlike the one incorporeal ghosts of later Western tradition, Norse Draugr were physical, decaying, immensely strong, malevolent revenants who could leave their burial mounds to attack the living, kill animals, and drive entire communities into terror. The saga accounts of heroic struggles against Draugr are not merely exciting stories, but reflections of a genuine belief system in which the dead were not safely contained, but potentially very dangerous neighbors. To prevent the dead from walking, various precautions were taken at the time of burial. A corpse might be carried out of the house through a hole cut specially in the wall, not through the door, so that the dead person's spirit cannot find its way back in. Scissors or other iron objects might be placed on the chest to weigh the spirit down. In some cases, the deceased's feet were bound, their head was removed, or heavy stones were placed over the body. These were not acts of disrespect, but of prudent caution. The Norse summer solstice was celebrated with bonfires and communal gatherings. In the far north, the midnight sun, the sun that does not set at all in high summer, was both a practical blessing, endless working hours, and a spiritual event of major significance. The reversal of this, the midwinter darkness in which the sun was present only briefly or not at all, was correspondingly one of the most spiritually charged periods of the Norse year. Norse communities were connected to their wider world through the network of mountain passes that linked valley settlements to each other and to the coasts. These passes were not casual routes, but carefully maintained paths, sometimes marked with cairns of stones to guide travelers through mist and snowfall. The people who knew these routes, and who could guide others through them safely, possessed valuable and sometimes life-saving knowledge. The Norse sled was a critical piece of winter technology. Horses and oxen pulled sleds loaded with goods, timber, and people across snow-covered ground that would be impassable to wheeled vehicles. Norse sleds were elegant and efficient objects. The Oseberg ship burial contained several elaborately carved sledges, suggesting that the sled was associated with high status, not merely utilitarian work. Skiing, too, was both a practical travel method and a competitive sport, with Norse mythology even including a skiing goddess, Skadi, associated with the winter mountains. The Norse were among the world's earliest beekeepers. Honey was the only sweetener available to them. Cane sugar was a Far Eastern luxury that reached Scandinavia only rarely and expensively through Arab trade networks. Managing hive colonies, harvesting honey and beeswax, and using both for food, medicine, and the production of mead were all established skills in Norse communities. Beeswax was used for waterproofing leather, lubricating metal tools, and coating wooden surfaces to protect them from moisture. Salt was essential and sometimes scarce in Norse communities. It was needed to preserve meat, fish, and dairy products through the winter. In coastal communities, salt could be obtained by evaporating seawater, but this was labor-intensive. Further inland, salt was traded from regions where it could be mined or harvested more efficiently. Control over salt sources was a form of economic power, and salt appears as a trade good in Norse commercial records alongside furs, iron, and slaves. The transition from the Viking Age to the medieval period in Scandinavia was not a sudden rupture, but a gradual transformation. Christian churches were built alongside the last generations of practitioners of the old religion. Latin literacy coexisted with runic writing. Old myths were recited in Christian households. The new gradually replaced the old, but the process was one of absorption and renegotiation rather than erasure. The Norse did not disappear. They became the medieval Scandinavians, carrying their past invisibly forward into a new world. The last great Norse pagan stronghold was arguably Sweden, whose rulers resisted Christianity longer than their Danish and Norwegian counterparts. The temple at Uppsala, that magnificent complex described by Adam of Bremen, continued to function well into the 11th century, long after Norway and Denmark had officially converted. The final integration of Sweden into the Christian world of medieval Europe took place gradually over the 11th and 12th centuries, closing the last chapter of the old northern religion's public life. The Norse impact on the English language was most concentrated in the northern and eastern parts of England, the former Danelaw, where Norse settlement had been densest. In Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and East Anglia, the proportion of Norse-derived place names, legal terms, and everyday vocabulary is significantly higher than in the south and west. This linguistic geography preserves fossilized language, the shape of a settlement pattern that is now over 1,000 years old. The English word law itself comes from Old Norse laud, meaning things that have been laid down. Similarly, bylaw, a local regulation, preserves the Norse by, meaning village. Outlaw directly translates the Norse utlajai. Wrong, weak, ugly, awkward, freckle, gap, fog, muggy, and ransack all come from Old Norse. Every time an English speaker uses these words, they are unknowingly speaking a fragment of the language of the Viking Age. The saga literature of medieval Iceland is not only historically important, but aesthetically extraordinary. Works like Jarls Saga, Egil's Saga, and Laxdæla Saga are among the finest prose narratives of the medieval world, psychologically acute, morally sophisticated, and narratively compelling. Written in a spare, unemotional style that trusts the reader to supply feeling, they describe with unflinching honesty the costs of honor, the nature of fate, and the ways in which even good people can be swept toward destruction by forces larger than themselves. The Vinland Sagas, the two texts that describe the Norse exploration of North America, were written down in Iceland centuries after the events they describe, but their core historical accuracy has been strikingly confirmed by archaeology. The description of a settlement with turf houses, a forge, and a carpenter's workshop at a place the sagas call Leaf Spear corresponds closely to the remains excavated at Lance Aux Meadows. The combination of literary memory and archaeological evidence makes the Norse discovery of America one of the best documented feats of medieval exploration. Modern genetic studies have transformed our understanding of Norse migration. Analyses of ancient DNA from Norse burial sites have shown that Viking Age Scandinavia was more genetically diverse than previously assumed. Norse communities included individuals of diverse geographic origin, reflecting the reach of their trade and raiding networks. A Viking Age burial in England contained an individual of Eastern European origin. Another in Sweden contained someone of Asian ancestry. The Norse world was a crossroads, not a sealed community. The distinctive oval brooches worn by Norse women, tortoise brooches, as archaeologists call them, are among the most recognizable markers of Norse female identity across the entire Norse diaspora. Found from Scandinavia to Iceland, Ireland, England, and even the Volga region, these brooches were not merely decorative but functional, holding the straps of the overdress. Their distribution across the Norse world maps the movement of Norse women and their cultures across enormous distances. Norse craftsmen produced extraordinarily fine jewelry using the technique of filigree, twisted and coiled fine wire soldered into intricate patterns, and granulation, in which tiny spheres of gold or silver are fused to a surface to create textured decoration. The finest examples of Norse goldsmithing rival anything produced in contemporary Europe or the Islamic world. They represent the application of extraordinary patience, skill, and artistry to metal that would have been worn, displayed, and admired in the firelit interiors of the great halls. The Norse concept of luck, hamingja, was not merely the random operation of chance, but a kind of portable spiritual force that could belong to a family as much as to an individual. A family's hamingja could be strong or weak, accumulated through good deeds and wise choices, and it could be passed on to descendants. A person of great hamingja was someone whose inner spiritual force aligned with the world around them in ways that consistently produced good outcomes. Bad luck was not random, but indicated a diminishment of this vital force. The Norse left traces in the night sky. The constellation we call Orion was known to the Norse as Frigg's distaff or Orion's belt, 3 stars in a row representing the spinning tool of Frigg, the queen of the gods. The Milky Way was called the Winter's Way, or the path to Valhalla. Reading the stars was not merely navigation, but a form of mythological literacy, the heavens populated with the shapes of the stories that gave the world its meaning. The Norse were among the first European peoples to make systematic use of water power. Early horizontal watermills, simple devices in which a horizontal wheel drove a millstone directly without gearing, appeared in Scandinavia during the first millennium and allowed communities to grind grain far more efficiently than by hand. The gradual spread of this technology was one of the quiet revolutions of the Viking Age, freeing up hours of human labor that could be turned to other purposes. Iron production was one of the great economic activities of Norse Scandinavia. In the interior highlands of Norway and Sweden, bog iron or deposited in peat bogs by the action of iron-fixing bacteria, was harvested and smelted in simple furnaces called bloomeries. The resulting iron was not the pure metal of modern metallurgy, but a spongy mixture of iron and slag that was then worked intensively by the blacksmith to produce usable metal. This process required large quantities of charcoal, and therefore drove substantial woodland clearance. The archaeology of Norse farms consistently reveals the importance of what might be called the hidden economy, the crafts and food production that generated no great monuments and left only the subtlest traces in the soil. The carbonized grain in a post hole, the fish bones in a midden, the fragment of loom weight in a collapsed floor. These are the residues of the daily work that actually sustained communities through their lives. Behind every heroic saga was a person who had ground the grain, preserved the fish, and kept the loom running. The Norse had a word, heimer, that translates roughly as homesickness or longing for home. For a people who so frequently left home on long and dangerous journeys, this feeling must have been a constant companion. The literature of the Norse is threaded with a sense of home as a place of warmth and belonging set against the cold, dangerous, indifferent world beyond, and with the knowledge that the journey home might not always be possible. The Norse world was one in which beauty and violence existed in the closest possible proximity. The same hands that carved intricate animal patterns on a wooden doorpost wielded the axe in battle. The same community that gathered to hear the old stories around the fire might, the following season, send its men to raid a foreign coast. The Norse did not experience this as contradiction. It was simply the nature of existence in their world, and they faced it with a directness that can still, across the centuries, take the breath away. The great halls in which Norse chieftains feasted were not merely dining rooms, but theaters of power. The seating arrangement was itself a political statement. The closer to the high seat at the hall's center, the greater the honor accorded to a guest. The distribution of food, drink, and gifts at a feast was a public demonstration of the Lord's wealth and generosity, and every person present was simultaneously a guest and a witness to the social order being enacted around them. Norse women who managed the household of a large farm were in charge of economic operations of considerable complexity. They supervised the production of dairy goods, textile, preserved food, ale, and mead. They managed the labor of household members and thralls. They maintained the household stores and controlled access to them. Those keys at the belt were not ceremonial, but functional, locking granaries and storerooms that contained the difference between survival and starvation in a bad winter. The lady of the house was an executive, not merely a host. The Norse world did not end. It transformed. The farms that Norse families tended are still farmed in some cases today. The fjords their ships navigated are still navigated. The stories they told of gods and heroes, of fate and courage, of the long dark winter and the return of the light have never stopped being told. In every telling, something of the original world is kept alive. A spark from the old hearth fire carried forward into a new time, still warm, still luminous, still capable of casting shadows on the wall. What we remember of the Norse across all the centuries is not only the violence and the adventure, though those are real enough. It is also the craft and the care. The hand that carved the comb, the woman who spun the wool to cloth, the skald who found the perfect words to hold a moment of grief in permanent form. It is the attention paid to the world, the seriousness with which life and death and honor and beauty were all treated. It is the knowledge that even in the hardest conditions, human beings reach for meaning, and sometimes they find it. The Norse word vijay referred not just to a killing, but to the formal declaration of a killing, because in Norse law, a killing had to be announced. A man who struck down an opponent and then walked away in silence was considered a murderer. A man who killed and then immediately declared it openly before witnesses had committed a legally acknowledged act that could be addressed through the compensation system. The distinction between murder and manslaughter, still central to modern legal systems, has its roots in this ancient Norse insistence on transparency. Compensation, gild or man price, was the cornerstone of Norse conflict resolution. Every free person had a legally established value, calculated according to their social rank. If you killed or seriously injured another person, you owed their family that value in silver. The system was not primarily about punishment, but about preventing the endless escalation of blood feuds, replacing the logic of revenge with the logic of restitution. It was an imperfect system, but it reflected a sophisticated understanding of how violence spreads and how it can sometimes be contained. The Thing Assembly was not only a legal and political gathering, but a social event of the first order. People came from great distances, camping around the assembly site for days or weeks. Merchants set up stalls. Marriages were negotiated. Old friendships were renewed. News from distant places was exchanged. For communities that spent much of the year in relative isolation on their individual farms, the Thing was one of the great gathering points of the year, a moment when the wider community became visible and present. Women could attend and speak at the Thing, though they could not vote or hold formal legal office. The practical authority of women in Norse communities frequently exceeded their formal legal standing. A formidable woman with strong opinions and the respect of her community could make her views felt in any assembly, regardless of the official rules. The saga literature is full of women who shaped events through force of personality, sharp counsel, and well-timed public speech. The Norse practiced a form of adoption that could create full legal kinship. To formally adopt a child, an adult would pull the child onto their knee at a public gathering, a gesture called knee setting, and declare the adoption before witnesses. From that moment, the child had full inheritance rights and was legally indistinguishable from a biological child. This practice gave families a mechanism to secure their futures when biological children were absent, while giving vulnerable children access to the protection of family structures. Norse naming conventions carried deep meaning. Children were often named for deceased relatives, not merely in memorial, but in the belief that something of the named ancestor's spirit, luck, and character was transferred to the child along with the name. To give a child the name of a respected grandparent was to invite that ancestor's qualities to live again in the new generation. Names were not arbitrary labels, but invocations. Nicknames were ubiquitous in Norse culture and could be brutally honest. Sagas are full of men and women known as the stout, the bald, the unlucky, the old, horsehead, and flat nose. These names were not always chosen by their bearers. They were applied by communities, and they stuck, becoming the names by which a person was remembered in the historical record. The Norse tolerance for unflattering honesty in naming tells us something important about their relationship with self-image and social frankness. The concept of shape in Norse belief referred not just to physical appearance, but to a kind of spiritual outer form that particularly powerful individuals could change. The hammer, shape-strong person could, in certain states, project their consciousness into an animal form and travel the world in that guise while their body lay sleeping or in trance. Odin was the supreme shape changer, taking the form of eagle, snake, or old man as circumstances required. The boundary between the human and the animal was, in Norse understanding, permeable for those with sufficient inner strength. Norse ships were not only built for war and raiding. The Nar, a broader, deeper vessel than the sleek longship, was the workhorse of Norse trade. Shorter and wider, with a deeper draft and a large central hold for cargo, the Nar relied more on its square sail than on oarsmen. It was slower and less maneuverable than a longship, but far more capable of carrying the heavy, bulky cargoes, barrels of fish, bales of cloth, livestock, that made long-distance trade economically viable. The Norse used a form of solar compass, a wooden disc with a central gnomon, to determine latitude by measuring the height of the sun at midday. By comparing the shadow length to a set of reference marks, a navigator could establish whether they were north or south of a known latitude and adjust course accordingly. Combined with their knowledge of stars, ocean swells, and wildlife, this gave Norse navigators a surprisingly reliable system for crossing open water without landmarks. The sound of a Norse harbor in the trading season would have been remarkable, a polyglot confusion of languages. Frankish merchants, Frisian traders, Anglo-Saxon buyers, Arab intermediaries, Slavic contacts, and Norse sellers would all have been present at the great emporia. Latin served as a common tongue among the literate, but most transactions would have been conducted in a rough commercial pidgin, supplemented by gestures, sample goods, and the universal language of the weighing scale. The Norse produced their own glass beads, using imported glass rods that were melted and wound onto a metal mandrel to create small, colorful spheres. These beads, found in extraordinary numbers at Norse sites, were used in necklaces, sewn onto clothing, and traded across wide distances. The vivid blues, greens, yellows, and reds of glass beads against the more muted tones of wool and linen clothing would have created striking visual effects in the firelit interior of the Longhouse. Norse textile production went well beyond basic woolen cloth. Tablet weaving, a technique using small cards with holes through which threads were passed, allowed Norse weavers to create complex pattern bands used as borders, straps, and decorative edging on garments. The patterns produced were geometrically intricate, and the technique required a trained eye and considerable patience. Tablet-woven bands found in Norse graves are among the most technically impressive textile finds from the medieval world. The Norse used natural materials to create cosmetics and personal care products. Red ochre was used as a pigment, possibly on skin, as well as on objects. Animal fats were combined with aromatic plant materials to make rudimentary ointments. Teeth were cleaned with chew sticks made from specific plants whose fibrous ends frayed into effective bristles. The archaeological evidence consistently suggests a people who took their personal appearance seriously and devoted meaningful time and resources to it. Norse communities had a keen sense of the comic. The sagas are threaded with dry, laconic humor. A man in the process of being killed pauses to make a wry observation. A farmer delivers a devastating insult in the most matter-of-fact tone imaginable. This deadpan quality, the refusal to express emotion at moments of extremity, was itself a form of performance, a demonstration of the self-control that Norse culture valued. Behind it lay a genuine comic sensibility that found absurdity in the human condition without flinching from it. The Norse flighting, a ritual exchange of insults performed before an audience, was a recognized art form with its own conventions and rules. Two opponents would trade increasingly elaborate and humiliating verses, each trying to out-insult the other while maintaining metrical form. The audience judged not just the content of the insults, but the technical skill with which they were delivered. Flighting contests appear in Norse mythology. Odin and Loki both participate in famous examples, and they survived in Scottish and English folk tradition well into the modern era. The great ships of the Norse Jarls were not merely vehicles, but symbols of cosmic significance. The imagery of the ship in Norse belief connected the vessel to the journey of the dead. Souls were sometimes conceived as traveling in ships to the afterlife, and to the primordial ship of Norse cosmology. The care and artistry lavished on great ships went beyond functional necessity. A magnificent ship was a statement about the power, ambition, and spiritual standing of its owner. Norse anchors were typically made from large stones with holes drilled through them, through which a rope was passed. Iron anchors existed but were expensive. Stone anchors were effective, locally available, and essentially free. The choice of anchor stone was itself a matter of some care. The right shape, weight, and surface texture all affected how well it would grip the sea floor. Experienced sailors knew the anchoring grounds of familiar harbors intimately, including which type of bottom, sand, mud, rock, would hold their stone anchor most securely. The phenomenon of the northern lights, the aurora borealis, was a regular feature of the winter sky in Scandinavia and the Norse Atlantic settlements. The Norse interpreted it variously as the shields of the Valkyries reflecting the light of their armor as they rode across the sky, as the Bifrost Bridge connecting the human world to the realm of the gods, or as the fire of the great serpent NHGGR illuminating the underside of the world. Whatever its interpretation, the aurora must have been a regular and awe-inspiring presence in the long winter nights of the Norse world. The Norse had a specific word, gesture, for the role of guest, and being a good guest was as much a social obligation as being a good host. A guest was expected to contribute to the household by sharing news, performing songs or stories, offering any relevant skills, and generally enriching the social life of those who sheltered them. A guest who was sullen, ungrateful, or demanding was a social failure. The relationship between host and guest was a reciprocal performance of mutual respect and generosity. Norse communities maintained what might be called a community memory through the oral tradition of genealogy. Knowing one's lineage, being able to recite the names of ancestors back several generations, was both a social skill and a practical necessity in a world where inheritance, legal status, and alliance networks all depended on family connections. The Norse sagas typically open with extended genealogies that modern readers sometimes skip, but that original audiences would have followed with close attention, recognizing names and connections that gave context to everything that followed. The Norse understanding of the human lifespan was unsentimental. Childhood was short, the transition to adult responsibilities came early, and the Norse did not have an extended concept of adolescence as a protected period of development. A 12-year-old boy on a Norse farm was performing adult work. A 14-year-old girl might be managing significant household responsibilities. This was not cruelty, but practical adaptation to a world where every capable person's labor was needed, and the margin between sufficiency and starvation was narrow. The construction of a longhouse was itself a communal undertaking. No single family could raise a longhouse alone. The timbers were too heavy, the construction too complex. Neighbors and kin would gather to help, the work accompanied by food, drink, and the social pleasure of collective effort. This pattern of communal labor, work bees in the Old English sense, appears repeatedly in Norse community life, binding people together through shared physical endeavor in ways that created obligations and bonds of mutual dependence. Norse doors were significant objects, both physically and symbolically. The main door of a longhouse or hall was often the most elaborately carved element of the entire structure, decorated with interlacing patterns and animal figures. It marked the boundary between the domestic world and the outside, between safety and danger, between the known and the unknown. Threshold ceremonies, specific actions performed when entering or leaving, were common, and the spirits believed to protect a home were often thought to reside at or near the door. The Norse practiced a form of conflict resolution through the payment of honor prices that went beyond physical injury or death. Insults, humiliations, and failures of respect all had legal standing and could result in compensation claims at the Thing. A person who was mocked publicly, whose hospitality was refused, or whose kin was dishonored could seek legal remedy. The Norse legal system attempted to put a price on dignity as well as life and limb, a recognition that social injury is real injury. Norse poetry frequently used the image of the path, or road, as a metaphor for fate. A person's life was their life road, and death was simply the end of that path, the point where the road entered the unknown. The metaphor carried weight in a culture where roads and paths were genuinely important. A safe passage through mountain or forest was a genuine blessing, and the person who maintained roads and bridges was performing an act of almost moral significance. The physical and the metaphorical were never far apart in Norse thought. The Norse concept of megin, might or power, was not merely physical strength, but more general vital force that could be accumulated, depleted, and shared. Thor's megin was his divine power, periodically restored by his appetite for the magical goats whose flesh he ate and whose bones he reassembled each morning. A warrior's megin could be enhanced by the favor of the gods, the possession of a powerful weapon, or the support of allies, and it could be diminished by betrayal, injury, or the withdrawal of divine favor. It was a conception of power as something almost metabolic, constantly in flux. The Norse feared nothing more than dying an ignoble death, dying in bed of illness, or drowning, or in circumstances that offered no opportunity for final courage. The ideal death was one met with full awareness and composure, meeting the end with a jest, a final blow, a last declaration of one's name and deeds. These death words, final statements made in the moments before dying, were remembered, repeated, and sometimes committed to verse. They were the last act of the performance that a Norse life was understood to be. Feasting at sea was a genuine practice on long Norse voyages. Dried and salted provisions were supplemented by fishing during the voyage, and on calmer days a fire in a sand-filled box could be lit on deck to cook hot food. The communal meal was important for morale on a long voyage. It maintained the social bonds between crew members and provided a ritual moment of shared comfort in the midst of the isolating immensity of the open ocean. A ship's cook was a valued member of any crew. The Norse used tallow, rendered animal fat, for a remarkable range of purposes. It burned in simple lamps made from soapstone, providing the flickering light by which winter evenings were spent. It was rubbed into leather to keep it supple and water-resistant. It was applied to wooden surfaces to protect them from moisture. It was used in simple medicinal preparations. It lubricated axle hubs and metal hinges. In a world without petroleum products, animal fat was the universal lubricant, fuel, and waterproofing agent, and the Norse used it with efficiency and imagination. The practice of sitting out on a burial mound to gain wisdom from the dead, utisita, was not the only way the Norse sought communication with ancestors. The midwinter festivale included a specific tradition of inviting the dead to participate. Food and drink were set out for deceased relatives, and the boundary between the living and the dead was considered especially thin during the darkest nights of the year. The dead were not merely remembered but welcomed back, however briefly, into the warmth of the household. Norse craftsmen developed an ingenious technique for measuring time using a burning candle or rope marked at intervals. The rate of burn was calibrated so that each section represented a known period. This simple technology allowed households to track night watches, divide work periods, and manage the timing of rituals and assemblies with reasonable accuracy. It was not precise by modern standards, but in a world without mechanical clocks, it provided a meaningful structure to the hours of darkness. The Norse used urine, specifically stale, fermented urine, rich in ammonia, as a cleaning agent and dye mordant. It was used to set dyes in cloth, ensuring the color would not run when the fabric was washed. It was used to clean wool before spinning. It was even used to clean metal surfaces. Norse households would therefore have maintained vessels specifically for collecting urine, a practical and economical use of what would otherwise be waste. The Norse instinct for using every available resource was comprehensive and unsqueamish. The relationship between the Norse and the sea was not simply one of mastery. Norse poetry and mythology are full of the sea's terror, as well as its utility. The deep ocean was a place of monsters, of the great Midgard serpent coiled around the world, of sudden storms that could end a crew's lives without warning. Every sailor who put out from a fjord knew they were entering a realm governed by different rules from the land, where human competence was necessary but not sufficient, and where fate and the mood of the sea gods would have the final word. Soapstone, a soft, easily carved rock found in abundance in Norway, was one of the most useful materials in the Norse world. It could be quarried with simple tools and carved into a remarkable range of shapes: cooking pots, lamps, fishing line sinkers, molds for casting metal, gaming pieces, and spindle whorls. Soapstone has excellent thermal properties. It heats evenly and holds heat well, making it ideal for cookware. Norse soapstone vessels have been found across the entire Norse world, from Newfoundland to the Volga, evidence of its value as both a practical object and a trade good. The Norse awareness of their own mortality was not experienced as morbid, but as clarifying. The knowledge that every day might be the last gave the present moment a specific quality of attention, a reason to act well, speak truly, and face whatever came without flinching. This is the sensibility that runs through the great Norse proverb collection, the Havamal, the sayings of the High One, attributed to Odin, which counsels moderation, self-reliance, honesty with friends, caution with enemies, and the importance of leaving a good name behind when the inevitable comes. The Havamal contains some of the most practical and psychologically acute advice in medieval literature. It warns against trusting too quickly, advises that a man should think before he speaks, notes that true friendship requires genuine reciprocity, and observes that it is better to be alive, however poorly, than dead, however heroically. It also contains passages of striking tenderness, reflections on the nature of love, on loneliness, and on the peculiar sadness of being a traveler dependent on the goodwill of strangers. Norse women who had been widowed held a legal and social position of considerable independence. A widow controlled her own property, managed her own household, and made her own decisions about remarriage. Some widows chose not to remarry, preferring the relative freedom of independent household management to the legal subordination of marriage. The Sagas contain several portraits of formidably independent widows who are among the most vivid and complex characters in the literature. The Norse produced a form of tar from birch bark through a process of destructive distillation, heating the bark in a sealed vessel to drive off volatile oils that could then be collected. This birch tar was used to waterproof leather, to caulk boat seams, to preserve wooden surfaces, and as a general-purpose adhesive. Traces of birch tar have been found on tools, weapons, and boat fragments across the Norse world. It was one of those quiet, essential products that made the Norse material world function, and its production required both knowledge and patience. The Norse concept of the good death extended to animals. A horse that had served its owner well might be given a formal burial, rather than simply being eaten or discarded. Dogs were sometimes interred alongside their owners. The care extended to animals in death reflects a broader Norse sense that relationships, even between humans and animals, created genuine obligations that did not simply end with death. To treat of faithful animals' remains with respect was a form of honor paid to the relationship itself. Norse navigation in coastal waters relied heavily on accumulated local knowledge of specific rocks, headlands, tidal patterns, and sheltered anchorages that was built up over generations and passed down through families and communities. This knowledge was not written down but held in memory, transmitted through storytelling and direct experience. The loss of a skilled navigator was therefore not merely the loss of a person, but the potential loss of irreplaceable practical knowledge, a form of death that could have consequences for an entire community's safety at sea. The Norse maintained their ships in purpose-built boat sheds, nasts, during the winter months. These long, low structures, open at one end facing the water, sheltered the vessel from ice and weather, and provided a workspace for maintenance and repair. The remains of nasts can still be traced in the landscape of coastal Norway today, their elongated depressions worn into the shoreline grass, marking the winter resting places of ships that have been gone for 1,000 years. The Norse celebrated the return of the sun after the midwinter darkness with genuine joy that had the quality of relief as much as festivity. In the northernmost parts of Scandinavia, where the sun might be absent for weeks, its return was not merely symbolic, but physically transformative. Light returned to the world, and with it the possibility of seeing, working, and moving freely. The Yule celebration that eventually merged with Christmas was, at its heart, a festival of survival. The community had made it through another darkness, and the world was beginning again. Reindeer played a significant role in the economy of northern Scandinavia, even for Norse communities that did not herd them directly. Reindeer hides made excellent waterproof clothing and bedding. Reindeer antler was a premium carving material. Reindeer meat and fat were valuable foods. Much of this came through trade with the Sami, who were the expert reindeer people of the north, a relationship of economic interdependence that shaped the culture and material life of both peoples over centuries. The Norse used a specific technique for felling trees that minimized waste. Rather than cutting straight through the trunk, they would score the tree at an angle, then split the wood along its natural grain using wedges and mallets. This radial splitting technique, still used by specialist craftsmen today, produces planks that are stronger, more flexible, and more water-resistant than sawn planks because it follows rather than cuts across the wood's structural fibers. The Norse shipwrights who split oak in this way were not merely skilled. They understood their material at a level of intimacy that took generations to develop. The spiritual life of a Norse community was not separated from its practical life. Religious obligations and agricultural tasks were intertwined throughout the year. Plowing was accompanied by prayers for fertility. The slaughter of animals involved ritual attention to the manner of death, and the harvest was followed by offerings of thanks. There was no secular space in the Norse world where the gods and spirits were irrelevant. Every significant action existed within a framework of spiritual relationship that required acknowledgement and care. The Norse left their mark on the moon, as well as the earth. According to Norse mythology, the moon is driven across the sky by a figure called Mani, who travels with two children, Juki and Bill, whom he snatched from a well on Earth. The sight of these two figures carrying their water bucket on a pole is what we see when we look at the man in the moon. Some scholars have suggested that Juki and Bill, whose names may connect to the words for increasing and decreasing, gave us the English names Jack and Jill, and that the nursery rhyme preserves, in faint outline, a fragment of Norse lunar mythology. The Norse were aware that their world was changing even as they lived in it. The sagas written in 13th century Iceland look back at the 10th century settlement period with a mixture of pride and elegy, a sense that the founding generations were larger, fiercer, and more vivid than the people of the author's own time. This retrospective heroism is a universal human tendency, but in the Norse case it was applied to events only 3 or 4 generations past, giving the literature an unusual combination of mythological elevation and personal immediacy. The last echoes of the Norse world can be heard in living places. In Iceland, geothermal pools still used for bathing stand near the sites of farms established in the 9th century. In Orkney, the Norse word for a young woman, lass, is still used in everyday speech. In Normandy, towns with names ending in beck, meaning stream, and tot, meaning homestead, preserve the voice of settlers who arrived over 1,000 years ago and never fully departed. The Norse did not vanish. They seeped into the landscape and the language and the blood of the places they touched, and there they remain. And so the last fact brings us back, as all good stories do, to where we began, to the farm, the fire, the family gathered close against the dark. The Norse world was vast and violent and beautiful and strange, but at its heart was a human world. People trying to feed their children, honor their dead, make sense of the forces that governed their lives, and leave something behind when they were gone. In this, they were not so different from any people in any time. The fire dies to coals. The snow falls softly on the roof. The stars turn. And somewhere in the oldest part of the night, the stories go on. The fire has burned low. The story for now is told. But there's always more to know about the people who came before us, those who faced the long dark with courage, who carved beauty into bone and wood, who crossed unknown oceans with nothing but the stars to guide them. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely, these stories deserve to be told, and you choosing to spend your time with them means everything to us. And if you're not ready to leave just yet, don't worry. We've got plenty more waiting for you on the channel. More worlds, more stories, more history brought back to life. Go take a look. Another story is waiting to unfold. If you want to be here for the next one, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Until next time, the stars turn, the fire holds, and the stories go on.